you. Lots of money with Liberty Mutual. We customize your car insurance, so you only pay for what you need.
Some car insurance, you only pay for what you eat or something in the background.
Only pay for what you need. Liberty, liberty, liberty.
All right, good evening, everyone. About 8:31, we might give it just 1 or 2 minutes, and then we'll get started. Hope everybody had a good weekend.
Hey, Mark.
New
Mark.
norm of weekends.
Mark, can you hear me?
Yes, who's that?
Can you go over MG, how to protect the MG patient, myasthenia gravis?
I'm sorry, say that again?
Can you go over, or just go over, how to protect an MG or myasthenia gravis patient?
Oh, all right.
This is Chris.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I don't know if there's something specific, but we'll incorporate that.
Thanks for being there.
Sure.
How do I unmute?
We'll take care of it on our side.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Oh, that's a good idea. All right, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started here. I'll mention this at the end, but as Jessica was just asking me to, she's still getting a few people asking her about the recording from Wednesday's talk that she presented. And so I'm going to put that link here in the chat right now, everybody, but I just sent that to everybody. But that link is on our practice website. So pcpnewburyport.com/announcements. If you look under the entry, actually under yesterday's entry for today's conference, you'll find a link to YouTube for that presentation. All right, so without further ado, it's 8:33. Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody. So tonight we're going to focus on, let's go ahead and let me just get the slides up here quickly. Yeah. Sorry, let me just get the screen share up there. All right, can everybody see this? Are we good? Are you good with that? Is it showing up? Okay, sorry. All right, sorry for the tech. Yeah, I'm unmuted. Okay, sorry, she's, Jessica's muting all the new folks and then I'm being muted at the same time. So that's why I'm going in and out. So I think we got it fixed now. All right, so Jessica talked last time about flattening the curve, what that's really about, providing some numbers. I actually meant to verify with Jessica, she might correct me here, but we talked about she talked about flattening the curve, buying time for the healthcare system, ultimately for medications, vaccines, answers, right, to the questions of how does this COVID virus work? How do we stop it? That the social distancing and quarantining, what it's all about, the terms that she threw out there about mitigation, which is sort of more along the lines of social distancing, suppression, being more about more strict quarantining, and the example cases of what happened in China and Italy, South Korea, Washington State, New York now, the differences, the changes and discrepancies in numbers and outcomes when they started at a very similar number, and as in the case with Washington and New York, it's happened over time. She talked about the trajectories of talking a bit about the numbers of cases at the time as of Wednesday, but also talking about the importance of looking at the numbers of hospitalizations and deaths as important markers, not just number of cases, knowing that the number of cases are going to just rise, no doubt, as more and more people are tested. And the numbers are, I think, probably wrong, but because I think I threw this up there, mistyped, but the differences in what we're looking at with trajectories in the US in number of deaths, if we did nothing, which is not necessarily what we're doing at all, but if we did nothing versus the severe flattening of the curve with social distancing, i.e. the reason why we're doing this at all, and that is to minimize and obviously reduce the number of deaths that that potentially occurring. So just a brief review since Wednesday, or in the last week on a clinical level, what I at least anticipated, and I think a number of colleagues I've talked to as well, is a real rise in not only testing availability, but especially in individuals asking for testing, knowing that testing was being discussed on multiple levels to be available. But surprising for me, and not necessarily a bad thing, didn't get a lot of requests of such. So we've, and furthermore, more importantly, unfortunately, as far as I'm aware, and I've been in streaming a conference that interestingly was originally slated to occur in Seattle, Washington. So that obviously didn't occur in person, but was streaming on Wednesday, Thursday, and Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. And so through even those conferences with multiple speakers, very, very high reputed and expert individual clinicians and researchers, nobody mentioned anything about new testing available in even different parts of the country, or even Canada, where a couple of speakers are from. So that does not seem to have manifested yet. Having said that, there definitely are more cases being reported as positive. Thanks to Sarah, our practice manager, she shot me a screenshot from a local, I think, website from a local TV station. I think that was Friday, maybe, showing, number of cases in those counties. In different hospitals, between locally Anna Jakes to Addison Gilbert Hospital out of Gloucester, to Beverly Hospital, to Leahy in Burlington, and multiple hospitals in Boston and the surrounding Boston, immediate Boston suburbs. So no doubt there are a rise in cases, but again, we expected that to happen. Do you want me to just summarize real briefly? Is that okay, or do you want to? All right. So just on the flip side of the spectrum, though, and maybe just to bring a little reality to this, because for most of us are, I'm sure, tuning in here from local to where we are here in Newburyport, Mass. But I think it was last night, Jessica was on the phone 2 nights ago. You want to talk about that? I just want to let Jess kind of chime in here briefly about what her experiences were, talking with a friend of ours from college. And I'll let, I'll let Jessica fill you in on here. I'll unmute.
Hi, I'm just sitting right next to him eating my ice cream because I'm an ice cream addict. Anyway, yeah, I thought I'd fill you in on a few things that are on the positive side in terms of things happening locally to Boston. Because I'm a faculty member through Brigham and Women's Hospital, I've set in on everything that they're doing for the COVID effort. And we get daily updates on what's happening. To put things in a positive perspective, they've done a lot of things that are very innovative. They've started, both Mass General and Brigham have started what they're calling COVID innovation to try to combat a lot of the efforts and problems that we see, such as lack of personal protective wear, lack of ventilators, etc. So they're developing in real time different ways to circumvent these issues. For example, they have something underway where they can sterilize a lot of the N95 and masks so they can be reused. It's not perfect yet, but it will help fight this. Another thing that they're doing is looking into an actual protocol where they can take one ventilator and treat 10 people. So that would be increasing the number of ventilators tenfold if they're able to do this. And I think they have a working prototype, but obviously I think there's a ways more to go. But I thought that was, when I talked last time about time and what time buys us, these are exactly the types of things that time buys us, even in the lack of, support of new PPE coming in and stuff. If we can innovate and do things like sterilize equipment better, learn how to multiply our use of ventilators, that's going to save a lot of lives. So for us here in the Massachusetts, Boston area, those are all positive reports. On the flip side of that, to tell you and get a little bit to the reality of where things are, I was speaking with one of my colleagues at Mount Sinai and in New York City, and asking her how things were there. She's the head of global health, and she was giving me a pretty grim picture. One of the things she had commented is anyone who works at Mount Sinai, even if they're just like a research assistant who just graduated from college, they were being, quote, redeployed to help out in the COVID effort. And right as she was telling me about this, that really everyone is being utilized as much as they can to help out with COVID, I went and I checked my email and got an email with that same word, redeployment, from the Brigham, basically with a questionnaire asking various ways that, potentially I and other people who are Brigham employees can be reutilized even though we aren't technically. So I'm just saying that to sort of indicate sort of, where we are. And I have just one slide today that I'll go through after Mark does about asking the question, where are we compared to some of the other towns like New York? Like when New York had our number of cases, how long did it take them to get where they are now? And where are we in the trajectory? How do we see us going in terms of flattening out the curve? But suffice it to say that this is going to be the week that the hospitals are going to become overrun. And so we're just sort of preparing for that.
Can you give just a brief summary on what Rachel was describing Mount Sinai to look like right now as far as their patient care?
Yeah, I mean, so
that was
for patient care, she said, I think it was 923 patients that they have with COVID in their hospital. I can't remember, I can look up the exact details, but basically every ICU bed is taken. A lot of the rest of the hospitals overrun. I can look up the.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's not to we're not trying to bring scare tactics into the picture, but it really is. On the one hand, it's when Jessica was showing those graphs that I'm sure those illustrations with the dots moving and what social distancing can do by keeping people separate and not. I was thinking after her presentation on Wednesday/Thursday that for those of us who are on the far ends of that empty room in that moving picture that she showed, it's really hard to grasp it's really hard to relate to or feel like it's pertinent as to why we're doing this, right? But then on the flip side of the spectrum, when you're like our friend physician Rachel in Mount Sinai, where every single bed, or seemingly close to every single bed, if not every single bed in the ICU is taken up with a COVID patient, and they're in the thick of this that we're talking about, like in Italy, where they're fearful that they are fearful of or outright cannot care for their patients because of lack of resources, then that's a real problem. And again, prevention is difficult, right? I think for human nature, because we respond to stimuli and stresses that are in our face better than we do preventatively, or at least most of us. So the further, if we were just looking at the numbers that I know Sarah had showed me, even like looking at Beverly Hospital compared to where we are here in Newburyport or Addison Gilbert, Beverly is much more in the thick of this than where we are in Gloucester or Newburyport. I mean, it's not that far of a difference. And so in a lot of ways, that really struck me, because that limited distance area is a drastic change in terms of number of hospital cases, at least at that time, of COVID cases, and such that had we not done the, arguably, had we not done the quarantining and the shelter-ins, or the more drastic mitigation moving into suppression kind of measures, perhaps those numbers would look very different within days to a week. Maybe perhaps we would look more like Beverly would look more like Boston. So, you know, these are realities and trajectories that we're trying to avoid, but it's difficult to feel as stressed about such without actually experiencing it. But hopefully we won't experience that, the most of us in America. All right, so that's this past week. So shifting gears a little bit, right? We've been talking more on the mass health level, not Massachusetts, but, you know, public health level last Wednesday, and so far reviewing today. What I'd like to do today is just capture a little bit about, so we talked about flattening the curve on a public health level for the sake of buying time for the healthcare system. And so the analogy or parallel that I want to bring to light today is, can we flatten the curve for us as individuals, which is not discussed, and this is just an analogy I came up in my own mind in the last few days, but with what not only I, but other clinicians, including Dr. George, who was on our call last session, with the webinars that we have listened to, and including the conference that I attended the last 3 days, although that conference was not at all focused on COVID. It's a West Coast / Seattle, Washington driven origin of conference coordinators. And so there's certainly a lot of talk about COVID, right? And so there's some really cutting edge information that I thought would be really interesting, and arguably, I would argue, applicable to us at the individual level, to be able to flatten our curves to reduce this spike. Not the spike in number of cases in the public health example, but to reduce the spike in damage to our individual bodies, and ultimately the end consequence, potential end consequence, should we contract COVID, and perhaps even reduce our risk of ARDS, acute respiratory distress syndrome. I'm not saying these are proven per se. I'm not saying that this is a guarantee by any means. But I think if you were to look at the data that we've been introduced to, it's very hopeful at the least. So moving on, very briefly, what's the review of the science on COVID? And again, I'm not bringing this up just to be scientific about it. I'm bringing this up with a purpose, and I'm also in part as background. I recognize there may be folks who are attending this either live or listening to it later who are more on a professional level, maybe collegial or scientific, et cetera, et cetera. And so I want to at least provide some scientific rationale for why we're talking about these things. And I'll just say now, if anybody actually wants the literature, the actual studies that this information is based on, because none of this is original information on my hand, all right? Let's just be clear. None of this is anything new I'm bringing up. This is just relaying information to you all on an expedient matter that I think is pertinent and applicable to the times that we're in. So the three targets that I want to talk about just very briefly that have really been focused on in among what I'd consider sort of like the cutting edge talk and understanding on COVID are these. Number one, there's this what's called a furin cleavage site. All right, these spike proteins, as you see those little red cones on that global sphere in that picture, as Jessica pointed out on Wednesday, each of those little red crowns, which is why it's called a coronavirus, corona being crown, each of those are what we call spike proteins. As you see in the picture, it's called an S protein there. When those break off, they allow for a very quick and effective entry of the virus into our cells. And it's something that's a little different than other coronaviruses or other types of viruses for that matter. And it allows for very high infectivity of very many different cells in the body. I don't even know if it's all cells, but so it allows fast transmission. Number two is this entity called an NLRP3 inflammasome. So what is that? Well, inside our cells, okay, so Jessica talked last week about the virus enters into our cell, into our cells. It uses our cells' machinery, replicates itself, and then the cell basically bursts and gives birth to all these baby viruses that go out there and infect other cells, right? And so in the process of the virus entering into our body, it sets off a cascade of inflammation signals, all right? One of those signals that occurs is this development of this inflammasome. So it's an inflammatory, it's not even really a protein, it's sort of like a package, a bubble package. So we make NLRP3, it's coded, it's named after a gene. It gets turned on and primed, if you will. If you look this up in online, if you read about it, you'll see that it talks about being primed. But when it gets activated, in this case by COVID, then it releases these inflammasomes. These NLRP3 inflammasomes then set off a cascade of reactions that lead to not only symptomatology, but significant pathology or cell destruction and cell death, et cetera. The third target we want to talk about briefly tonight is called the angiotensin II receptor, here abbreviated ACE2 receptor. These receptors, while it's not clear that I've heard or understood that there's specific ways to bind that per se, it is an important piece of information for research, and it's also an important bridge into understanding why people are not only more apt to develop respiratory distress syndrome, but also why people who have diabetes and high blood pressure and heart disease especially are more apt to have pathology and have more greater consequences. And that is because this angiotensin II receptor is found throughout, it's a receptor that is heavily mediates cardiovascular damage. So those with who have vascular disease already have their buckets filled up much of the way, if you will, and it doesn't take a whole lot more to spill the bucket over when COVID adds to an angiotensin II receptor pathology process. As I put it there in the parentheses below. So in fact, not only the angiotensin II receptor, but also the NLRP3. So again, people who have high blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, they've already got a sort of half-filled bucket, if you will, or some percentage filled bucket as a result of already pre-developed levels of NLRP3 inflammasome activity and angiotensin II receptor activity. So how do we try to mute that, all right? Ultimately, we've talked here so far about the virus entering into the cell and creating damage to us, but it's become rather clear at this point, what everyone's talking about is, while we're awaiting ways to try to kill off the virus or avoid spreading the virus and letting the virus sort of die out, a lot of the problem that's leading to hospitalizations and respiratory distress and death is actually what's called, as I put down here at the bottom, cytokine storm. This is basically, if we want to put it in real layman's terms, it's overreactivity of the immune system. And so, sure, we could be infected by a number of different assaults, but how do we react to that? And I think that might speak a little to that question that someone threw out at the beginning about myasthenia gravis, right? People who have an autoimmune disorder already, whether it's an officially diagnosed autoimmunity condition or not, there are a lot of folks, as we know, who are diagnosed or told they have some kind of autoimmune condition, but it's not really, doesn't really have an official name. We're talking about the fact that people overreact in their immune system. And so how do we quiet that down? And that's a lot of what the talk is about right now in flattening the individual's curve, right? We're trying to avoid the spike in that high curve and keep it lower so that people can be sick at home, but actually recover nicely rather than be hospitalized. Okay, so this is just to show you how complicated this gets, nothing else. This is a very brief diagram, but it's just to show you that, as an example, ignore the fact that this illustration was taken from the perspective of a dendritic cell, but any kind of cell. This is to show you one singular naive, what's called a CD4. It's a type of cell in your immune system, the T cell. It splits out into 5 other cells. These 5 cells split into other pathways. Those other pathways create a ton of different effector profiles, they call it in this slide. And all those profiles have some effect on a role in some disease. This is extremely complicated, all right? This is what our immune system looks like. I will refer a little bit, maybe briefly, to that Th1 and Th2 and the Treg piece, but just by category. I don't want to get scientific here at all. I just want to show you that this is really complicated because it does have meaning in terms of rationale to why the specific interventions that I'm going to talk about tonight have been touted or supported by experts and clinicians around the country. Okay, so a real brief sidebar here. Again, speaking perhaps more so to those who might be listening live or later who come from a more professional background, I mean, what we're talking about here is really more translational medicine. So how do we define that? We're talking about taking raw data in studies, right, that are very reductionist, what we call reductionist, meaning 1 + 1 = 2. But as you saw from the last slide, it's far more complicated than 1 + 1 = 2. It's this huge network and spider web where everything kind of overlaps and everything kind of intertwines. And so when we take information, for example, there are a lot of studies that I'll allude to that were done in mice. Well, we could argue, someone could argue, well, they haven't been shown to work in people. All right, that's true, but that's a starting point, right? And there's a lot of things we do in mainstream medicine all the time now that started out with studies in mice. So it's not to say that we can take that with we've already found the answer, or it's the needle in the haystack. But it is to say that, hey, in the case where we don't have the time right now, all right, and if we can argue that the benefit significantly outweighs the risk, the more the benefit outweighs the risk, then it's worth considering. And so this may be translational medicine in some cases, and in other cases it's less translational because there have been studies not only in cell plates in a lab, but also at other times in animal species. Maybe it's an animal, maybe it's humans. So what we call in vitro being lab and in vivo being in a live entity. But we've got to recognize, everyone's got to recognize the context that this is not necessarily like proven information per se by FDA approval. And because what does it take to get to that point for mainstream medicine requirements? Well, it's sort of my perspective on things in the U.S., but where the way the U.S. is set up with the healthcare system, where insurance is involved and there's a lot of financial factors involved, when any kind of academy or organization, much less the government, is going to make some proclamation that this is a recommendation, this is a practice guideline, this is an FDA approved or CDC approved, yada, 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 they've really it's got to be robust. I mean, really robust, because money's on the line and insurance companies are going to have to eventually pay for that and such. And so it takes a lot to get to that threshold, but there's a lot that doesn't meet that threshold that still is effective. I mean, if it's effective for 80% of people, but the threshold is it's got to be effective for 85%, then does that mean we should ignore those applications that are helpful for 80% of people? I'm making that up, but you get my point. So again, in this case where we don't have enough time, and the factors that the interventions we're going to talk about tonight are arguably very benign to very benign, the proposal here is we should really consider them. Just brief examples, I remember when I was in residency, and it was this kind of hot topic that, wow, there's a study that shows that women who take probiotics in the last 6 weeks of their pregnancy, their babies who are assessed into 3 years of life have less risk of asthma, eczema, and allergies than the newborns who were born to mothers who didn't take probiotics. That, wow, probiotics could make a difference. What is that, 17 years ago, that was kind of hot news. Now it's like, of course probiotics are helpful, right? I mean, it's hot in the research. The microbiome is the big topic, but that was discussed 17 years ago as sort of more quote unquote translational medicine. This topic called small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which some of you are familiar with, many of you probably aren't, that's been in discussion in the functional and integrative medicine worlds for years and years, and just now is kind of hitting mainstream medicine, where there are gastroenterologists more often than primary care doctors who are testing for that now, and it's becoming a legitimized condition. Intestinal permeability, I can tell you firsthand when I was in residency, and a faculty member who introduced us all to a paper talking about leaky gut syndrome, and we all thought he was kind of nutso because we'd never heard of this. We didn't have any context for it, and now it's this big thing that it's not I wouldn't call it acceptable medicine per se in practice with mainstream medicine, but it's the medical term intestinal permeability is what people have been calling leaky gut for many years. And without, I didn't take the time to do it tonight, but I can tell you that it was legitimized in around the late 90s to early 2000s by a Mass General researcher, Alessio Fasano, who is still practicing and doing research. And it is absolutely legitimate, it just wasn't in clinical practice. So all this to say, translational medicine is what we're talking about tonight for the most part, but it's not without merit. Okay, so enough of that. So let's talk about these targets, right? So target number one is no particular rank order here. The NLRP3 inflammasomes are shown to be reduced by melatonin, nitric oxide, and vitamin C. Target two, the furin spike protein, is very arguably stabilized and kept from cleaving or breaking, and therefore leading into the cascade of infectivity by vitamin C and what's called angiographis. Some of you may have heard of that, others may not have. In target three, back to the angiotensin II receptor, the real key here is if you are a patient, and this is very common, even among my patients in our practice, my own patients, if you are a patient on an ACE inhibitor medication, arguably the most common blood pressure medicine out there, it would be at your best interest to switch that out. Additionally, if anyone is taking excess selenium, that is also known to exacerbate this angiotensin II receptor. What happens in this case is the ACE inhibitor, this medicine blocks the angiotensin enzyme. And so what happens is the receptors get hypersensitized. The angiotensin II receptors upregulate, we call it, scientifically, medically, we call it upregulate. So more come out because it's almost as if they hear the signal has quieted, and so they're straining their ears to listen more closely for more of it. They need more of it. They want more of it. They feel like it's missing. And so we don't want those receptors upregulated because when they are then activated by the COVID cascade, now people are in real big trouble. In fact, the talk is that this is the understanding of how it leads to respiratory distress among the other, among these three targets. That's the big sort of catalyst. Furthermore, there's a bunch of different interventions that have a multi-target approach. Stinging nettle and quercetin are two of the ones that really came to my mind. Woo, that's some thunder. And that's why I showed you that complication cascade previously on the one graph, because a lot of these compounds like stinging nettle and quercetin, they can impact multiple interleukins and T cells, and so it may not be one of these like prime upstream targets as in 1, 2, and 3, but ultimately the intention is to reduce the cytokine storm, we call it, or the immune overreactivity, so that people don't develop such extreme symptomatology and pathology / disease. So at the bottom here, I've just clicked for you a small piece of a slide that was taken directly from this high-profile conference on Thursday night, where here it shows angiographis is a powerful anti-furin strategy. So this is like translational, right? This is all the way back from 1999. It's shown that angiographis it has been able to block this furin cleavage in various kinds of other viruses. Now, it has not been shown in COVID-19 because obviously it wasn't known back then, but where it has been shown in multiple viruses, and I believe it was shown in specific different kinds of coronaviruses of that class as well, it's of benefit to consider. Vitamin C has been shown to also have anti-furin properties, and specifically they did some studies in regards to COVID-19, specifically in this case. So again, I'd have to look at that, I'd have to remind myself looking at that study, did that really show it you know, in a lab setting, in a person study? I would assume it's not person, but nonetheless, this is the sort of reason for it, for these arguments. All right, so just a couple little more detail about melatonin. Why melatonin, right? This is, yes, as I was asked today, this is the melatonin we're talking about that people take to sleep better or try to go to sleep. So it's, as Jessica pointed out, I believe last Wednesday, and as many people know, the data is showing that the far majority of people who are having more significant illness are older in age, right? I think it's like 14.8% of those who are experiencing death are among the COVID patients are 60 or 65 and older, whereas the number of cases of individuals who are being seriously impacted in the 15 years under, definitely 10 and under, are extremely low. Similarly, there's been some other patients that women are testing positive for COVID from China and in younger individuals. The pregnant women have almost twofold the normal melatonin that they normally otherwise would have, or their age-matched peers would have. And as we mentioned before in the previous slide, melatonin has a lot of impact on that NLRP3 protein and further. So as you see here down below, there's just actually, there was 2 full slides worth of studies talking about why melatonin is being proposed as an argument of intervention. Here I just clipped again from that same speaker on, from a different slide from Thursday night. Here's a study talking about melatonin impacting the, sorry. Okay, yeah, showing that melatonin can severely counteract the severe inflammatory response through that NLRP3 inflammasome. That in the second paragraph you'll see again here in rats, but nonetheless that it was actually shown to reduce acute respiratory distress syndrome even. There were several studies where it was used in combination with mitochondrial supports, or in combination with vitamin C, or in combination with something else, whether in acute respiratory distress syndrome or in sepsis, so infection through the bloodstream, or in heart damage and heart. I don't know that was actually heart attacks, but individuals being hospitalized for some kind of heart-related event. Again, all these events through the NLRP3 inflammasome, that the melatonin was helpful. Note too, just to myself here, that again, interestingly, there were studies on both nitric oxide and vitamin C inhibiting that same NLRP3 inflammasome, again, both in the lab and in actual living entities. So it's not just a lab study in those cases. All right, moving on. There we go. So let's, yeah, so here's a list of suggestions. All right, let's get down to the pragmatics. So here's a list of suggestions for folks. Prevention. So moving beyond Jessica's, where we picked up with Jessica's last talk about social distancing and quarantine and such, and the obvious with hand washing and masks and gloves, etc. So there's a spray called HOCl, right? It's an acidic spray. You can find it on Amazon and elsewhere. It's not been shown, as has nothing ever been shown to directly disinfect certain bacteria, viruses, specifically COVID-19, where it's so new. But the take-home message on this, from fresh off the press from this weekend's conference, is that it is more effective than alcohol sanitizers. All right, so anyone who's doing any kind of cleaning of their hands. I mean, I walked into a local place to get some food today, shopping, and they have an alcohol sanitizer at the front. They want everybody to use that. You know, it just comes to my mind that, okay, it's better than nothing, but it's not as effective as washing with soap. And a lot of soaps have this HOCl. Jessica, I think, had really kind of burned it into our family's head in the last couple of days, that something she was reading, that about 20 seconds of soap hand washing is what is really the most effective. Oh, it was through the individual that she was talking to some, I think, oh, it was an ICU hospitalist, I believe, at Brigham, who said he's really, by his own digging into research and and talking to colleagues, has really felt much more reassured despite interacting with COVID patients day in and day out, recognizing he is just looking at his hands like a constant point of contact that he needs to be extremely mindful about and constantly washing his hands with, washing and keeping sanitized.
And especially the real thing is making sure you're washing your hands, but then the contact points are, he realized he sees COVID patients every day. He has no concern about getting it because it really is contact of your hands with your eyes, nose, or mouth. And if you can prevent those, you're good. So often, you know, one of the things he said, men, maybe you grow a little bit of a beard, you're less apt to touch your face. He said, even if you're wearing a bandana around your head, it at least makes you conscious of when you start to touch your face, because we do it so unconsciously that if you can start to gain some level of consciousness of it, you can prevent touching your face. And really, that's the key thing. Anytime you go anywhere, you come out, you sanitize your hands before you touch any part of your eye, nose, or mouth.
Right. And so taking that one step further, this HLCL spray, I won't get into detail about it, but this well-renowned clinician, he's suggesting to his patients that they basically spray that, you know, use that as a cleansing spray wherever. We've gotten some for our office now. He actually puts it into a mister or some sort of like personal device that he also got on Amazon for like 16 bucks. It's made by a company called Relay, R-E-L-E-E. I just got in the mail today, I believe. He just dumps it in there and he just sits there and sprays it on himself, around his face, on his hands, and all over, all day long. So that could be a relatively easy, pragmatic consideration. So we talked about melatonin already. If you already use it, fantastic. If you don't, it's worth a consideration. How much melatonin are we talking about? One group of very high profile panelists from a webinar on Wednesday night, the one right before that George and I were both listening to it before we got on this one that Jessica presented. They were suggesting even as little as 3 milligrams could be helpful. I don't know where the data rationale comes from on this per se. The other expert that was speaking on Thursday night that I've been referring to several times tonight, he historically has been using high dose of melatonin in a lot of patients, especially those who have autoimmunity or immune system dysfunction. And he's been using doses into the tens to sometimes hundreds of milligrams, if you can believe it. He himself is taking 70 milligrams a day right now. I would argue that the older in age we are, the more we should be taking, because that's the key, is that the older we are, the less we have. So it's likely going to be something that we have to ramp ourselves up to for those who aren't using it already. So no harm starting at 3, 4, 5, especially if we're not heading out of the house at this point, and it's not so much of an issue if we're a little tired in the morning. DHIST I bring up because when I heard all these talks about stinging nettles and previous, those of you on here who are patients in our business, a lot of people about DHIST. We use that a lot for just seasonal allergies. I found that to be much more helpful than Claritin, Zyrtec, and the like. But DHIST has both stinging nettles and quercetin in it. To me, we're in that sort of seasonal allergy part of the year. I certainly have been sneezing.
I think we lost them.
Sorry, here we go. Humming is known to increase nitric oxide in the nose, and whereas so again, we talked in the previous slides about nitric oxide being known to impact those one of those targets, those 3 primary targets, it's an easy, cheap, and effective again, translational medicine. How do I do that? Oh. All right, sorry about that. Yes, who are mouth breathers, and you probably know who you are. Would not be shocking if those mouth breathers tend to get infections a little more often, especially in the upper respiratory system. So, you know, I was starting to practice a little bit on my last 8 hours or so. Boy, it made my throat a little bit sore. It's like using a muscle I just haven't. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Okay, sorry. Micronutrients, why is that important? Again, this is more specific to those of us who are older in age. There was talk again about how much micronutrients really are important for the immune system, and the fact that as we age, our immune system is weaker in part largely because the micronutrients are poor. This is a bigger topic, but Dr. George was educating me just before last session on Wednesday about the World Health Organization's comments in past years about our waning crop nutrition, and so that's for another day. But that's likely a big source of why our nutrition is poorer, even if we're eating extremely healthily. Last thing, garlic, there's some load up on that, and avoiding ibuprofen is important as the ibuprofen can facilitate pulmonary edema, develop respiratory distress. All right, so moving forward, these are sort of my integrations of what I've learned the last just 3 days, literally. And so they're somewhat arbitrary, but if someone were to develop early symptoms, then where might we go from there? I would definitely be thinking about the propolis. I don't think I mentioned it yet, but propolis is a, I'll get back to that. Yeah, I'll get back to that. Propolis comes from bees. It is a residue that they use to coat their prey that they've killed and are storing for later. So presumably it may have some antimicrobial activities for them, but it certainly is an antimicrobial. Again, I can feed anybody who's looking for evidence and literature. I can give them the directions on that. But propolis spray is something we can just spray in our up our nose, into our throat, and it is known to be effective on the cilia, the mucosa of our oral pharynx and our nasal pharynx. And so, again, I didn't mention it earlier, but where we know now that the COVID virus can sit on the mucosa for up to 5 days before symptoms initiate, then we know that is sitting there before it develops, it converts into a greater symptomatology or pathology. And so at early signs of symptoms, if one can start propolis, it is arguably to be of some benefit. Now, I'll take that a little further and say that this 70-year-old clinician who is well respected and reputed, who provided this particular lecture on Thursday night that I keep referring to, he has done this with a number of patients. He says he has treated over 30 COVID patients to date, and he's not a hospitalist by any means at all, far from it. But he has treated 30-some COVID patients, many of them using propolis, and finding it to be of good benefit. He's not finding even higher risk patients that they are not progressing in their disease. And so again, it's, we could argue it's a small sampling, perhaps it's, just observation, yes and yes, but hey, what else are we going to go with right now? Okay, it seems to be a benefit for people who are using it, including himself. Angiographis is something we're starting at this point, perhaps increasing that vitamin C. So this gentleman was, he is now having folks, and he's not the only one who has mentioned this, he's having folks take mega doses of vitamin C. So now let's talk a little bit about dosing. When practitioners who treat with intravenous vitamin C for, let's say, cancer, and this is done at like Kentucky University, I know they have that up on their website. I know University of Miami down in Florida has a program doing this as well for cancer patients. As some of you may know, it is publicized now, widely publicly known, that many, maybe all hospitals in New York are giving patients who are more severely ill IV vitamin C, all right? And this is an interesting topic. I won't sidebar on this too long, but it's a constantly debated topic in medicine. There was an ICU specialist years ago who was arguing that a specific cocktail of IVs that are just micronutrients, but very focused on vitamin C, was very helpful for sepsis patients. And many other in the mainstream community didn't really believe it. There's been a lot of studies to try to replicate that data back and forth. And in the end, it's not robust enough by any means. And so it's never been adopted by mainstream medicine, but it's been out there. And a lot of people still use it on different levels. Well, it's kind of interesting how that in the COVID context, it doesn't seem to be questioned. And New York hospitals are using it left and right. Well, so in those kind of patients for cancer, let's say, they're using 25 grams sometimes. All right, that's a lot, 25 grams and sometimes more, but at least 15, 25 grams in a single dosing. I don't think that's what they're doing in New York City, but I'm just giving you context. When you look at a vitamin C supplement orally, which is not well absorbed and not going to be as effective into your bloodstream compared to an IV, I was just at CVS today and it was like 250 milligrams sometimes, up to 1,000. So this gentleman is having people take, 5 to 10 grams, 5 to 10,000 milligrams, so long as it's tolerated, once a day. And then if they're actually developing symptoms, he's having them take like 2 grams every 2 hours, because vitamin C is a water-soluble vitamin that washes out pretty quickly. And so multiple dosings a day is necessary. But hey, it's cheap, it's easy, and what's the downside? Well, if you take too much, you're going to get a little diarrhea and maybe a little nausea, all right? But if you're already starting to get sick, I think most of us would probably be willing to test that line rather than develop worsening COVID. And so it's a consideration. Higher dose melatonin from what you might have been doing before, maybe higher dosing of the DHIST, again, for the downstream cytokine storm that we're trying to reduce. By blocking EMFs. This gets into a little bit more translational medicine, but there is some suggestion, there's been a lot of suggestion by a lot of different folks about the harmful effects of EMFs on multiple levels. We won't get into that today, but let's just suffice it to say, there is the data behind it, which again, I can point somebody to if they really want to know. It's about a cellular level effect of entryway of the information cascade into across membrane barriers, and that the Wi-Fi EMFs, the EMFs really facilitate entry through those membranes. And so blocking the EMFs is argued or proposed by some to be of benefit. Again, this is more just observational, maybe coincidence, maybe correlation, we don't know, but there are folks who, it's not necessarily secret that Wuhan, just not long prior to the COVID crisis, had rolled out a tremendously large 5G program in their area. And similarly, this doctor who I keep referring to, who's practicing in Seattle, the Seattle area, says that their hospital area had also prides itself as one of the first of the largest 5G providers in the U.S. So relation, coincidence, don't know. Inhalers, we know about. I think everyone knows about that. And there was some questions that have been thrown around over the last few days about, hey, if people are sick, do we really need to worry that much about, nutritionally, should people be doing fasting, partial fasting, be sure everyone's eating enough, etc. There's nothing wrong about calorie restriction per se. There's a balance, no doubt. It's individualistic. Talk to your provider, but it's worth a consideration. vitamin E, I'm just going to throw on the list. I won't get into that detail tonight, but there is some rationale for that as well. All right, so moderate disease, this is going to be up to the providers, obviously, but here, let's just say, how do we say this? Most everybody at this point, if not everybody, knows about what people are referring to as the French study. It's not really a study in France, but the lead author is from France. It was a international collaborative paper. But the studies on hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, I don't know, it's pretty strong. And I didn't want to put the graph, I'll be honest with you, I did not want to put the graph up here today. You can find that on the internet easily. The graph from that study showing the benefit in patients who are not on either versus on hydroxychloroquine alone versus on the two together is pretty compelling. And my understanding from that paper,
The moon was out during the storm.
6 days out from using that combination medication, that medication combination, people were testing negative to COVID and were symptoms essentially negated. Other considerations that have been discussed in the last half week or so, especially in these various conferences and expert panels, immunopeptides, again, for immune system stability and I don't want to say immune suppression, but regulation, or what we call immunomodulation. And some of you in our practice anyway are familiar with what are called SPMs. Jessica had said to me that she had done some research on this topic as well. These are called specialized pro-resolving mediators. These are sort of
The kids playing games.
fine-tuned fish oil, if you will. They're sort of distilled, specialized fish oil. I'm not sure if I can hear myself if you want to meet everybody again.
When are you gonna stop again?
And then finally, for those, there's some interesting.
That would be like a week ago.
No, I didn't. Oh my god.
No.
Sorry guys, we're gonna figure out the mute. You got to go to manage down here.
Really?
Myself again. All right. Sorry about that. Okay, so for the very few people who might be on this medication called disulfiram or antabuse, it's historically used to reduce alcohol cravings, but has been used as an antimicrobial in Lyme disease. So there might be a few people on this call who are on that. It's a very novel treatment. Again, how does that come out to be? So actually it was government sponsored, where they were looking at a host of roughly 30 to 50 different medications that are sort of old and relatively unused, and looking at their properties for various purposes. And it was actually found to have some benefit in Lyme disease. Those of you who are taking it, there's a lot of hubbub about it, and there's people looking into, or at least observing, whether patients who are already on it, if that might be some benefit for that with COVID as well. So if you read about that or hear about that upcoming in the next couple of weeks, don't be shocked. I'm just putting it out there in case people have already heard about it. It's nothing that's well established at all. People are just observing right now. Electromagnetic fields. Sorry, EMFs are electromagnetic fields. We're talking about Wi-Fi there, which is why I accidentally said Wi-Fi. All right, just a few other points of interest. Number one, again, I'm really speaking more to for people who are really doing a lot of listening and reading on the internet or various resources. Some of you may have come across this topic about is there a concern for people who are of blood type A particularly. I'd heard that. I didn't know anything about that. It's just another one of those false truths or false fake truths or whatnot. So it turns out there's actually rationale behind this. It turns out that one of the specialists on really smart guys, first time I ever heard him talk. Some of you may have heard of this gentleman, Dr. Giordano. He's, I think he originated up in the Portsmouth area, interestingly, who did a lot of this work on the blood type diet and what kind of impacts our blood type may have on our, what some people might metabolize better with foods, et cetera. Well, so he's one of these expert panelists. And he spoke and showed the research that people who have type A blood obviously do not have the antibodies to that protein called A, the A protein. And it turns out that the A antibody is helpful to fight against this COVID infection process. And so people who are type A just don't have that antibody, and they're more apt to be sicker. And so of interest, this is just for if anybody wants to go digging down this rabbit hole, but there was some commentary that there are certain lectin type foods. Lectins, some of you may or may not know, these are often healthy foods, mostly vegetables that are contain a certain kind of compound in them called lectins. They're often vegetables that have seeds inside them. So tomatoes, peppers, certain legumes, including peanuts and cashews as legume nuts, that there's some argument that perhaps eating certain lectin foods, they have an A-like protein that is not exact enough to be that is not exact enough such that the individual will develop an antibody that will attack their own blood, but enough that it will cross-react for their benefit, possibly against COVID and or other COVID-like infections or infectious-like processes. So anyway, kind of an interesting point, but there's actually a rationale why those with blood type A may be more susceptible. Again, for those who are on ACE inhibitors as medications, so which kind of medications are we talking about? There any medication for blood pressure that ends in the letters PRIL. Lisinopril is extremely common. Moexapril, there's a whole ton of options, but anything with PRIL on it, that is a bad thing to be on if you contract COVID. There are many other options. There are a lot of blood pressure medication options. So talking to your practitioner about the consideration to change over to other medications, especially these that we call ARBs, they're called angiotensin receptor blockers, which might arguably actually be beneficial for those who might contract COVID, because they actually would block the receptor that COVID actually processes through that translates into respiratory distress. And in fact, as I mentioned in point 3, we mentioned here mold toxin patients, but it isn't necessarily just mold toxin patients. For those of patients who are in our practice who are on this or listening to this who know what we're talking about, those of you who've had a high transforming growth factor beta-1 lab test result, you know that, you'd likely know that sometimes we place patients on ARB blood pressure medications simply for that reason, even if they don't have a high blood pressure. It all relates to the same foundational science. Back to this topic of autoimmune patients. So this is where, again, we pull in the myasthenia gravis topic. Those patients, yeah, there's basically an imbalance in the immune system, right? And so how do you immunomodulate or try to regulate that out a little bit? Again, these SPMs could be helpful. Low-dose naltrexone may be helpful. Peptide therapy is something that's newer and very potent, but newer on the scene, so a lot of people may not be familiar with it. More expensive. SPMs and peptides are both a little more expensive, but very worth their value. And then again, we mentioned in the elder population, micronutrients, just a high potency professional grade multivitamin can be very helpful. Lastly, some of you may have heard of skullcap, especially Lyme patients. That is an herbal, is known also to affect what are called endosomes. So these are, we talked about that NLRP3 inflammasome. Well, there's other package bubbles that get sent off inside the cell that affect other cascades. If we can stop those signals from happening through these endosomes, if they bind together, if we stop them from binding and moving on in their usual march or their usual journey, we can make some efforts to stop this development into respiratory distress. Again, skullcap and chloroquine, which is actually was studied prior to hydroxychloroquine in Wuhan for COVID, they can be helpful in those regards too. Last thing I'll mention on this slide, immune boosting. We can't do a whole lot about what are called these Treg cells I mentioned from that slide. I don't want to get into it in detail, but these natural killer cells, NK cells, they are definitely, there's great reason to, these are heavily involved in the COVID attack process from the body, and in a good way. So a lot of you have been asking about, in this case, a lot of times supplements that are known to boost the NK cells. Yeah, if you can still get your hands on them, I mean, they're pretty much very difficult to get at this point, but there are a number of different at least supplements we know that can increase NK cells and the immune system. But certainly, as we talked about last time, you know, what's done is done in terms of our lifestyle and where we're at right now. So on an emergent, urgent basis, there are certain things we can do, and hopefully we can start working on some of those. It's never too late. It's never too late to start working on some of those foundational pieces that have to do with our lifestyles that lead to immune system support. So wrapping this up, let's bring this back to the big picture, right? We talked about Wednesday, Jessica talked about flattening the curve on a public health level, what the benefit and purpose is, and why we're doing what we're doing on the social distancing side. Tonight, we're talking more about trying to flatten the curve for us individually. Again, I don't want to take the focus off of prevention. We talked about already, but just to re-summarize, distancing, the HLCL spray, hand washing, gloves, etc. Prevent, but further, especially in the next few weeks, if we start having more people test positive, all right, and we start trying to prevent the progression of subclinical infection, all right, we know, as I've spoken about many patients, we know that people can carry COVID and not help. And so what is it that leads people to symptomatology? That's a lot of what we've talked about tonight is part of that process, and we're trying to keep people at bay where they're either asymptomatic or minimally symptomatic, right? And so trying to prevent the progression is all about what we've tried to discuss tonight. And again, what we're talking about partly is prevention of actually contracting the virus, but also prevention of development of the disease by dampening the immune system's overreactivity. And then ultimately, as we just said, you know, it's not, Dr. George spoke on this a bit more at length and eloquently on Wednesday night, but perhaps, I like the term he used, perhaps this really can be also an opportunity as a wake-up call to each of us to be asking ourselves, well, as I just said, what's done is done. Where we're at right now, this time, this day is where we're at. But really, what's been going on under the hood for us individually, you know, in our health? We may feel fine, we may not be in pain, we may not have constant whatever, headaches, pains, or fatigue, etc. But there's a lot of people where we feel one way, but what's really going on under the hood is a different story. And a lot of us, most of us, if not all of us, know that kind of story from, say, like our automobiles. Diabetic and heart disease and high blood pressure patients, I think this is a great reflection on, wow, a lot of these other pieces of the puzzle, the NLRP3, as a great example, that's a mediator in disease with diabetic and high blood pressure and heart disease patients. It's also something that will lend itself to worsened outcomes in COVID patients. So there's a lot of interlap that a lot of times we don't think about on a day-to-day basis. So, you know, whether it's now when we have the time, when we're more homebound than at other normal times, quote unquote, or post-COVID, maybe it is really worth thinking about and reflecting on what our health is really about, especially gut health. That's a huge topic that I think Dr. George alluded to again last Wednesday. Again, balance of the immune system, it's a big seesaw, and for everyone it's a little different of a story, especially those quote unquote autoimmune patients, whether you have a definitively diagnosed mainstream termed autoimmune condition or not. But for tonight, for now, hopefully this info has been helpful for the crisis at hand, and really in the end, without minimizing the need to flatten the curve on a mass health level, the intention here is to say there are tools. I'm personally greatly encouraged by what I've learned in the last 3 days, enough so to decide to put this info out to as many people as we can, because I personally will be applying a lot of this to patient care already now. In fact, I was given permission today to, I'll wind up with this example. I was on the phone with somebody today from our practice. It's a family, 2 parents, 2 children. And one of the parents said to me, you know, we're freaking out. My mother's friend's son, who's only about 30, just got hospitalized at Portsmouth Hospital and is on a ventilator. And they assume he has COVID. Well, his mother was with my mother, and they were, you know, et cetera, 2 days ago. And then my mother came over and was babysitting our kids for a couple of hours. And now who does my spouse who work, does he need to be quarantined? Do we need to be quarantined? Right? It's a great example because it encapsulates a lot of what we were talking about Wednesday and today. Okay, so first of all, on the quarantine side of things, it's not an official. There's no official recommendation when you're talking about third kind hospitalized on the ventilator. His mother does not have COVID, and they're waiting for his test results. Could his mom have COVID? Very possibly, but she's not tested positive. So what's the recommendation there? Well, the official recommendation is we don't know until he tests positive. If he tests positive, then she should be quarantined for a set amount of time. But what do you do in the interim? All right, well, does that extend to anyone she's been in touch with? And then in this case, the individual's mother. And then does that extend to the family that I'm talking with? I mean, how far does the extension go? We don't have answers for that, all right? But here's how I thought that out and how I explained it. I said, well, to be safe, that hospitalized individual's mother should be quarantined, just for safety, right? And in at this time where there's so much quarantining and sheltering in, it's not a hard decision. It's not a hard, you can't go wrong. Does the individual who I was talking to, does their mother need to be quarantined? Well, in this case, again, they decided to quarantine themselves. Fine, easy decision. Do they really need to be? I don't know. But here's our decision for this patient and their family. The possible contact with the mother, the individual's mother, the individual who I was speaking with, their mother was 2 days ago. We know that there is a median, statistically, of 5.2 days for symptom onset. That mother has not developed symptoms yet. So any potential of COVID germs, let's call it, on the surfaces in their home, which have been shown to last 3 days or more, all right? So there's potential. If there was transmission from 2 days ago, then we're looking at a watch time of maybe Wednesday, you know, on average, maybe into Friday. 5 days would be Wednesday, 7 days into Friday. And so between now and then, let's be proactive, right? So we talked about starting or increasing melatonin. We talked about doing vitamin C, and we talked about doing the DHIST, especially where a couple out of the 4 individuals deal with some, you know, mild to significant allergy issues. And so that was our decision. And if things worsen, then we'll step up into the next realm of options, as I kind of outlined tonight. You know, there's no protocol here. There's nothing that's shown, guaranteed, proven, tested per se. But I'm not freaked out. I feel like we have more tools in our toolbox. That's the bottom line. There are ways I feel confident to flatten the curve for those individuals who are asking these kinds of questions. And my hope is that, you know, with time, again, on multiple levels for flattening, whether the public health curves or individual curves, we'll continue to evolve more and more strategies. And so as we learn, or if we learn further strategies, we'll be doing our best to translate them to you all as well. All right, let me turn it back over to Jessica here for a little bit. Yeah.
Okay, and I'm going to share my screen.
Off share.
Yeah, now mute your phone. Mute that. Okay, let's see here. If I get it, so I don't have my video camera on, and I'm worried I'm going to goof something up. So we're just going to go without the video camera for now. I really just have 2 slides I want to show you. They're actually basically the same slide, just with one modification. And we're asking the question, oops. We just want to ask the question, you know, how are we doing so far with flattening the curve? We hear about flattening the curve, and how are we doing right now with flattening the curve? And oops, I'm just going to keep it like this, yeah. And So I thought for a point of comparison, we would look at 2 other places and where they were in real time. So what I tried to do was, these are the actual data from New York, Massachusetts, and Italy. And I tried to align this day. Now, these obviously happened at different times in each location, but I tried to align a day and time where we were all at the same count. And that was actually a week ago exactly today. And I want to look and see how this plays out when we look at the different trajectories here. So we have some good news. When we look back, a week ago to New York, when they were at 525, and this is probably actually 2 weeks ago for New York, 7 days later, they were at almost 16,000. When we look at that same time at Italy, now Italy, it's hard to tell because we were somewhere between these 2 days. But when you fast forward, Italy had about 4,600. So right now, it actually looks like we're tracking quite close to Italy in terms of the trajectory here and the number of cases. Now, if this is true, that we are tracking towards Italy, what does that mean in terms of time? Well, we could actually fast forward the actual data from them 1 week, 2 weeks, and 3 weeks, because they're over 3 weeks ahead of us. And if we follow that trajectory, we will expect in a week that in Massachusetts, we'd have about 20,000 cases. In 2 weeks, we'd have about 50. And in 3 weeks, we'd have over 80,000, probably veering closer to 90. But there's a couple things I do want to point out. So one thing that's very good here is, number one, we are not doing as badly here as New York. New York, I know they've really ramped up their testing, so their numbers may, are higher anyway, and I'm sure we are still underreporting our cases, but the slope trajectory that we have is way, way lower than New York. So that's good. Another thing I wanted to point out is that we have to realize that when we started social distancing, we are not going to see the effect of social distancing really for about a week or 10 days out. So really, when we look at this, really our impact on social distancing really started happening, somewhere around here. So when it comes to the effects of mitigation, and the changing of this curve to slowing it down, we're really hoping that this week is a week that we will start seeing those effects. Now, granted, that is also put concurrently with the fact that we're doing increased testing, so we'll have a better overall representation of the cases. But really, the mitigation effects we should start seeing in the next 10 days or so. And so what we want to see is, these numbers keep on staying low. Now what happened in Italy, their mitigation really didn't happen, I think, until closer to this time range. So their actual spike, where it really started jumping up, was a little later. It was a little bit after this. So, they went from 4,600 and then really started jumping up high after this time point. So their sort of inflection point in the curve happened a little bit later. New York's happened earlier. And the hope is that we will have an inflection point curving down or flattening out more in the next week. So even though right now it looks like we're tracking with Italy, I'm hoping that the effects of the social distancing we'll see more this week. But if we want to be real, and we don't really see any difference in effects, these are the types of numbers we can be prepared for in the next 3 weeks or so. And as we know right now, Italy's closer to 100,000. However, when you look at their data, it does look like they're closer and closer to the peak of their number of cases coming up now or sometime within the week. Just to give you an idea of where they are, I would expect that would probably be the case also with Massachusetts. I would do this with other states, but I just did this sort of at the last minute. But different states are seeing different trajectories. That's for sure. So anyway, I just wanted to share that with you guys to give you an idea of where we are.
Is that it? Yeah. All right. So good. So with that, I think we'll just wrap up tonight. Hopefully hopefully somebody's found this information helpful. I might suggest that if we've had some feedback of various sorts from Wednesday. We'd be interested in your feedback here as well going forward. I don't know that what to anticipate in terms of what kind or how much information will be available and necessary to put out, in what kind of interval of time. But some considerations that we've thought about, as we're in this sort of temporary new norm with being housebound. I've talked with a couple of other colleagues of various sorts, and some considerations might be, if it's helpful to you guys to maybe do like a session where we have somebody who is like a physical therapist and can talk about exercises for the home, for people who are working from home, posture matters, ergonomics with your work setup at home. For those of us who are just used to being at the gyms and being without apparatus, what else can you learn to do at home? For those of us who don't have a history of exercising and want to use this opportunity to start an exercise program, again, there's plenty of things we can do on our own at home without even much, if any, equipment. They'd be more than willing to, spend a session making that the focus. If there's some small tidbit for like 10 minutes to share on other clinical topics, fine, or Jessica, with other tidbits that she can share, great. But at least the focus being that, or perhaps I would imagine mental health being a big of interest, whether it's mood issues, anxiety-related matters, people feeling more and more frustrated, pent up, et cetera. We know that therapists have talked a lot about their work with patients on telehealth and finding that to be a real need right now, PTSD, et cetera.
Another one that I think that we should, if people are interested in, is just really a Q&A, answering questions. So you guys can type in questions in the chat, and then we can just go dynamically from there, or, something like that. I think often, Mark tried to make today really resourceful, from what can you do for your personal health to optimize your health and minimize your risk of disease. I've tried to give you sort of an overall profile of the epidemiology, what we could expect. But this is really about you and your questions. Sometimes I think weeding through the scary parts of the news, showing everyone dying, and the reality of the situation, and trying to look at things objectively, sometimes it's best to just talk some of that through, rather, so that we can sort of disentangle drama, scare from reality, and just thinking with your eyes straight forward and the simple steps that you need to take to protect yourself.
Yes, great idea. So, whether it's through some kind of Facebook link on, or maybe the ideal thing for centralization of responses is through the personal care physicians Facebook account, or through the YouTube channel, one of the two. If anybody's got any kind of feedback about interests for some kind of ongoing series at all, feel free to let us know. If there's not interest, there doesn't need to be an ongoing continuation either. So it's up to what people are interested in.
And if we wanted to do the Q&A time, we could start with some questions that people, we could post it, start with questions people have answered us ahead of time, but then also take them dynamically in the chat as we're discussing.
Sure. Yeah, sounds good. All right.
Okay.
Good. Be well. Stay safe.
Have a good night.
Have a good night.
You too. Enjoy.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Hey,
Thank
Mark,
you.
I have a question.